My name is Todd Adams, and I am the President and CEO of Pension Fund of the Christian Church. I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of the Insurance Board to host this webcast on financial best practices and financial ethics for congregations. Thank you for joining us today. Throughout the webcast, you'll have the opportunity to pose questions using the chat feature. We'll do our best to get to every question during the webcast, but we might not be able to get to all of them. Also, today's presentation is being recorded. Presentation materials will be available following the webcast. So if you missed something or you're not able to write it down throughout the presentation, just know these resources will continue to be available for you. And again, don't forget to pose questions using the chat feature throughout our presentation today. So let's talk about financial ethics and best practices for congregations. Today, our session objectives include covering a review of basic internal controls and best practices to help your congregation protect against fraud and theft. We'll also talk about things to consider during the COVID-19 outbreak and how to handle money while our congregations are not gathering for weekly worship. We'll talk about budget and accounting issues for congregations, and we'll do a brief section on clergy expense reporting. So let's get started. And again, don't forget, this webcast is being recorded and you can post questions using the chat feature, and we'll do our best to get those questions answered throughout the presentation or at the end. So I'm a certified governance trainer for BoardSource, and BoardSource identifies that there are 10 responsibilities that every nonprofit board should engage in annually or biennially as part of your ongoing planning cycle and leadership. Among those characteristics and responsibilities, there are 3 that relate to financial ethics. The first is providing proper financial oversight. The second is ensuring adequate resources and participating, which means you, as a leader in your congregation, should also be financially supporting your congregation. And the third is to ensure legal and ethical integrity while maintaining accountability. Throughout our presentation today, we'll be covering these 3 key points from the 10 responsibilities from BoardSource. So let's start first with internal controls. So let's talk about some questions that you as church leaders ought to be considering. For example, how many of you have had the same person in the same financial role, say your treasurer or your financial secretary, for more than 3 years? How many churches have dual custody of the offering at all times, from the time it's received in worship until it is deposited at the bank? How many of you deposit money on Sunday immediately following worship? How many churches have written financial policies for how money is to be handled? And how many of you have had a theological conversation about how the offering is handled once it is received? Oftentimes, when we think about internal controls or we think about proper controls for financial purposes in our congregations, we think of very complex, cumbersome, and burdensome systems. Many times, though, our financial controls in our congregations are very dated, simple, or even non-existent. For example, one of the primary controls that many of our congregations utilize is trust. Think for a second about the financial people in your congregation: your treasurer, your financial secretary, the counters. How would you describe them? Most of us would say, well, we trust Mr. or Mrs. Smith. Well, we trust Mr. Jones. He's been counting the offering for 30 or 40 years, taking it home every week, and we never had a problem. Well, trust is defined as assurance, reliance on the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. It is one, a person in whom or in which confidence is placed. We place confidence in their ability and their honesty in handling transactions, paperwork, their human contact with the system, and our ability to find and correct errors. However, primary internal controls should be accountability or accountable processes. Accountability is defined as an obligation or a willingness to accept responsibility. Accountable is something that you can measure and explain. It's a documented process with paper trails and documentation where someone else can come in from the outside. They can take a look at what somebody else has been doing and be able to retrace their steps. If you learn anything today, I hope you walk away with the following words. My friends, trust is not an internal control. We need to make sure that we have accountability and accountable processes in our system. We need to make sure that we protect our volunteers who love God, who love Jesus, and who are serving their churches. We want to protect their reputation, and we want to make sure that if somebody were to make an accusation against them, that we have an accountable process in place that we can prove the trustworthiness of our leaders. But just remember, trust is not an internal control. Well, let's think for a moment. As a church, let's talk about the theological context in which we handle money. For yourself, why do you give to your local congregation? How does your local church use these gifts? How many of you resonate with the following statement? These are the gifts of God from the people of God for the work of God in the world. Do the controls in your local church honor this statement? We in worship ask people to bring forward gifts to be shared for the betterment of the community in which we serve, to further the mission of the church, to provide important resources for ministry and for mission. And yet, how often does the offering get left on the communion table or stuck in an envelope and put into a secretary's desk drawer? Maybe you have a really sophisticated system and you've got cardboard mail slots in an office where somebody just simply closes up an envelope and sticks it in there for someone else to come and count later on. Or maybe, like one congregation I worked with, you have the magical plastic box stuck under a desk that surely nobody is going to know that there are thousands of dollars or the gifts of the people of God for the work of God in the world sitting right there in that box. True story, congregations actually get shopped by people who plan on committing crimes and stealing from the church. That's right. I've worked in a couple of settings where the church has been robbed during worship, after worship on Sunday morning, or during the night. And it turns out the people who committed the crime appeared first as visitors on Sunday morning. One example, they watched the choir members go into the choir room. They watched the women carry their purses over their shoulders into the choir room, and they watched them process out of the choir room without their purses. During worship, these visitors got up, left the worship service, and never came back. What turns out is they were in the choir room stealing the wallets of all of the female choir members. Another congregation had people case the church on Sunday morning. They would come in for worship. They would see the offering be received. Somebody from the couple would get up. They would follow the deacon who might be carrying the offering back to the office and see where it was placed to uncover the process. No one suspected it. We all have visitors on Sunday morning, and we certainly don't want you to be suspicious of people who are coming to worship with you and potentially become part of your worshiping community. However, we have to utilize good practices so that those whose intentions aren't pure and aren't to be part of our community, we're protected from their ill will and their bad intentions. So here's some questions for you to think about as church leaders. How is the offering handled at your church on Sunday morning? What are the best practices that you should consider? Where do you think that your church might be exposed? The best practice that any congregation can engage in is to have written policies, to always have the offering in dual control, to always have non-related people counting the offering, to always take the money to the bank after worship. And while maybe not so environmentally friendly, to think about some basic best practices like receiving from your local bank the plastic one-time use deposit envelopes Get 52 of them for the year or one per service for the year. Date them, number them at the beginning of the year. Then if somebody opens that envelope, they've got to use another one of the single-use envelopes in the coming weeks, and that will help you to catch that maybe something happened on one of those weeks that we need to be paying attention to. So let's talk to our local bank about getting rid of the zipper pouch bags or stopping the practice of leaving the deposit in the secretary's drawer overnight for the secretary to take to the bank on Monday morning, and look at those one-time use plastic bags that are available from your local bank. And again, date them, one per Sunday, one per service, and number them for the coming year. And then on the 13th week of the year, I should have bag number 13 and the date should match. So we have some key players in making these decisions for our congregation. Our key players include our finance committees, our financial secretaries, our treasurer or business administrator, an audit committee, and our pastor. Yes, pastors, you have a role and a responsibility in maintaining the financial ethics of your congregation and ensuring that best practices are followed. Let's remember, friends, if you want to undo a ministry or you want to do damage to a local congregation, have a financial mismanagement happen, and it will set your congregation back for years to come. Well, let's talk for a minute about the role of the finance committee. The finance committee should be focused on monitoring the receipts, the commitments that people make, and managing the expenses of the church. They should develop and implement a budget with the treasurer and review financial reports to ensure that we're on track both with our income and our expenses. The finance committee should be reviewing those monthly financial reports and statements. They should be aware of where our excess funds are invested and how we're managing them and any restrictions that might be placed upon those funds. And the finance committee should be working with the pastor to help make a ministry plan for the coming year and to understand the ministry plan for the coming year so they can anticipate when expenses might ebb and flow. I think one of the challenges for all of our congregations is that we tend to talk about money in terms of dividing our need by 12 months or even by 52 weeks. And we talk about dividing our expenses by 12 months or even 52 weeks. And we put out misinformation to our members. Our income does not come in evenly every Sunday or every month, nor do our expenses, um, nor are they incurred evenly over the course of 12 months or 52 weeks. So let's ask our members, how do you plan to make your gifts in the coming year? Let's talk about the cycle of ministry for the congregation and report out when we expect that we're going to have larger expenses, such as maybe an insurance payment is due, or we're going to send kids to summer camp. And so we know that the youth budget is going to look pretty high and out of balance in June and July, and then it will even out for the rest of the year. Or maybe we have a large donor who only makes a gift one time for the year. Let's make sure that we're putting our giving and our financial statements in the best supportive light possible and truly using these resources and these reports to tell the story of the ministry that we're engaged in. The finance committee should also be working to provide someone who reconciles the bank statements. That person should not be involved in making deposits, nor should they have check writing or check signing authority. They should sign the bank statement, that they opened that bank statement unsealed, and then they went in and reconciled the bank statement, ensuring that receipts match the actual transactions, match the records that are in the actual checkbook or the accounting software. The finance committee should also maintain our banking relationship and recommend policies such as check signers and signing limits. How do we get an invoice approved? How does the treasurer know when they're authorized to pay something? What are reoccurring expenses that we just want the treasurer to go ahead and pay? These are all things that a finance committee should give consideration to, and they should provide leadership and guidance in the form of a written policy. They should also talk about what is our investment policy. Are we willing to invest funds in market-based investment vehicles? Do we only use our local bank or denominational foundation or investment house for that work? And then the finance committee should work with the pastor to interpret our spending in missional language. These resources provided by our members, again, the gifts of God from the people of God for the work of God in the world, do mission and ministry every day. So let's celebrate the work that we're doing with these gifts and the accountable way in which we are being responsible for the resources entrusted to our local congregation. Other roles the finance committee should consider: how do we make a transition between treasurers? Best practice is that every 3 years, you would rotate treasurers, financial secretaries amongst other people and leaders in the congregation who have that capacity and skill set to serve in that way. But there should be a transition process in which the books are turned over, signature cards are facilitated, new signers are signed on to the account or given access and passwords to our accounting software. The finance committee should also ensure consistency in the application of our best practices, our policies, and our procedures. These three make up our internal controls. How have we said we're going to pay our bills? How are we going to make our deposits? How are we going to invest our money? What are our practices, our policies, and our procedures? Also, the finance committee should help advise the pastor on planning and visioning, as well as any committees or the board leadership in the life of the church. Well, let's talk about a policy checklist for a second. Policy checklists should be written policies approved by the board, again, approved by the board and written down, that govern check signing limits. Do we require on non-reoccurring transactions more than one person to approve an invoice? Do we do things like only paying from invoices and not from statements? Do we require that our checks on the front say two signatures required for a transaction over 500 or 1,000 or $10,000? Now, keep in mind, that is only for a merchant. The bank is not responsible if you require two signatures. With electronic clearing today, they will clear a check that only has one signature, even if it says this check must have two signatures over 500 or $10,000. Other policies we should give consideration to would be investment vehicles. So again, we have excess funds. How do we manage those? How do we maximize the return? What risk are we willing to take? What's a balanced approach? Who will we do business with? Will we allow a member of the congregation to invest those funds on our behalf? Or do we have denominational resources through our denomination foundations where we could place those funds and they could be professionally managed, and we could be assisted with the development of our own policies by our professional fundraising staff and foundation managers? How will we handle wills, bequests, or trust gifts? Would we accept a bequest from an estate that had strings attached? Like, we'd like to give you $1 million, but you'll have to paint the sanctuary hot pink in order to receive it. Do we have a policy in place that would prevent that from happening, or that would prevent the church from splitting if we had to decline a gift? How do we utilize gifts that are left in memory of someone when the family says, in lieu of flowers, please make a gift to mom or dad's home congregation? Do we have a policy? Do we need to go back to the family and ask permission before spending those funds? Would we allow them to direct to a gift that maybe isn't helpful to our ministry right now? Do we keep a list of items that it would be helpful? We'd like a new sound system or upgrades to the flower beds or to replace the coffee service in the fellowship hall. And so the pastor has a list that the family could choose from when those gifts are being received. And then how do we account for memorial funds? How do we track them to ensure that if there is a designation, that we can honor the designation that we've agreed to, especially if that money is placed into an endowment? How do we make sure that we don't utilize gifts restricted for a particular purpose or just our general operating, because maybe we're in a situation in which cash flow is tight? So let's shift now to the role of the financial secretary in a congregation. Our financial secretary should be overseeing the process of receiving and recording the gifts. Our financial secretary should have a team of people who count the offering each week and should work with the pastor to send out giving statements. I think it's a best practice for the pastor to know what people give to the congregation and to sign a letter explaining how the gifts have been used in the last quarter, or write a handwritten note expressing gratitude for the financial support of the congregation and its mission right on the giving statements when they are mailed. Some of the best practices for internal controls and working with the area of ministry for the financial secretary would include keeping our gifts again in dual control at all times, meaning our counters collect, escort, and process the contributions. No one is ever left alone with the offering by themselves. We also develop a standardized form and process, such as photocopying checks, and have clear separation of duties. Before I go into the basic rules of handling the money, I do want to remind you that this webcast is being recorded, so you'll have the opportunity to review some resources as well as handouts following the webcast. And I want to encourage you to keep questions coming using the chat feature on our webcast today. So let's talk about basic rules of handling money. We want to ensure that our counting teams are not related. No parents with a child or spouses counting money on the same week at the same time. We want to make sure the money is deposited immediately after church. So it's counted and then deposited. We don't place it in a safe or a lockbox or a secretary's desk drawer and leave it for the next day, unless that safe is big enough that at 6'5" and 220 pounds, I could stand up in the safe. I know several congregations that had small floor safes and thought they were doing the best practice. Those safes were stolen overnight because two large individuals could pick it up and carry it out. So if you feel the need to keep the money at the church, or maybe you have professional staff who count your offering on Mondays with other individuals, let's make sure that safe is not only bolted to the floor, but that it is big enough that somebody my size could walk in and stand up, so that nobody is going to walk off with your safe. But again, the best practice is to count the money right after church, fill out the deposit slip, and use the night drop at the bank using those one-time use plastic envelopes that are available from your local banker. Also, we don't want the treasurer who's writing checks to be part of the counting team. And unless you have a professional business administrator, it's best if employees are not asked to be part of a counting team, except under extreme circumstances on Sunday morning. We also want to make sure that our forms are filled out. So if you have counting forms where you are recording cash, checks, and other gifts, that those forms are filled out and that they are signed by each of the counters each week, so we know who was on the counting team and actually did the work, in case there's ever a question or an error, not because we're looking to place blame, but just so we know who to go back to. And maybe we have a training gap and we need to do some additional training with some of our counters. So I've got a list here for you now of how we can have our separation of duties and what the two counters should be doing during the process. And this list will give you what they can be doing, even though separate, in the same room at the same time, and each doing each part of the process, like counting the cash, photocopying the checks, running a tape from the checks as well as from the photocopy, comparing the tapes, preparing our deposit slip, signing our form, and sealing up our bag. We also want to talk about gift acknowledgement. So our financial secretary, who is recording what people are actually giving, would be sending out a quarterly statement of giving. I recommend, again, adding a personal note from the pastor or a letter updating the church on the ministry that has occurred in the last quarter as a result of their gifts. We also want to make sure that we're including in the tax statement that no goods or services were received in exchange for these contributions. Now let's shift to the role of our treasurer. Our treasurer is the person who operates the accounting software, or if you're still keeping a manual check register, keeps up the manual check register, generates the checks for us, provides monthly reports to church leadership, works with the finance committee to build the budget, and works with the pastor on a narrative budget. I recommend that the financial reports be made available to the body in the church that has responsibility for oversight of these at least 7 days prior to the meeting. In many of the cases where I have worked to clean up after an embezzlement, one of the common themes was that financial reports were either provided at the last minute, they were not available, or maybe the treasurer couldn't make the meeting so nobody could ask questions about what was really going on, or simply just confused. So we want to make sure that we have those reports in writing, available plenty of time in advance for people to review them and to be able to ask good questions. I would recommend or prefer that I have a quarterly financial statement over monthly and have it 7 days in advance, then have it monthly and have it walked into a meeting. So again, a lot can happen budget wise in a quarter that you wouldn't necessarily see month to month, but I'd rather have 4 financial statements per year and time to review them before the meeting than I would have them once a month with no time to review them. I also want to point out a resource that is available to you. This is provided by the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. It is a church treasurer's handbook. It is kept up to date by our Office of Treasury Services, by Disciples Church Extension Fund, by the Pension Fund of the Christian Church, and the Christian Church Foundation. And that is available on disciplesmissionfund.org under Treasury Services. So again, the Church Treasurer's Handbook is an excellent resource for policies, guidelines, compensation, benefits, and internal controls. Let's talk now about handling money during a pandemic. I'm willing to guess that no one on this webinar has had to help lead an organization under the extreme and unique circumstances that we find ourselves in here in April of 2020. So what are some things that we could be doing, and what are some resources that are available to us as congregations, or things we ought to be thinking about how we keep money flowing, how we encourage people to continue giving, and how we manage our cash during this time? I would encourage you, if you have not yet signed up with an online giving platform, to take a look at Givelify, Zelle, or Venmo, or a combination thereof. There are also other resources that are out there. Givelify, in particular, is designed for congregations. It has text to giving, online giving, credit cards, as well as e-check. Zelle is a banking platform that allows people to transfer money from their checking account into your Zelle account, which you then transfer into your checking account. Venmo works the same way, just with different contribution limits per week. If you have not yet gone to an online form of giving, I would highly encourage you to do so to make it easy on your members to continue to give during this time, but also going forward. I would encourage you to look at the credit card fees, which is what stops a lot of congregations from doing this. And I would encourage you to see those as a cost of doing business, a way in which people can continue to give, and an ease for your members who are not in worship every week. Prior to the pandemic, I traveled almost every week for work for the last 13 years. If my congregation didn't have some sort of form for online giving, my giving would be very erratic. But now I'm able to give on a regular basis because we have an online platform through our website where I'm able to go and to make my gift once a month. I would also encourage you to take a look at the website for the Center for Faith and Giving. Their website is centerforfaithandgiving.org. They have a toolbox, and included in the toolbox are electronic giving resources and about a 30-minute webinar that you could look at. Electronic giving also provides great security in terms of processing the gifts, moving the money, because the money moves from one bank to another bank, and there's not an opportunity for any human error in terms of counting the money or for the money to be redirected or misappropriated. So let's ask some questions that we ought to be thinking about as leaders. And just want to pause again and remind you that if you have questions you'd like to pose to me, please continue to use the chat feature, and we'll try and do our best to get to all of the questions during this webcast. So, what are some things we ought to think about as leaders for handling money during a pandemic? Well, how is the mail secured without staff coming to the church if people are mailing in their gifts each week? Are we continuing to have the mail delivered? Is it delivered to a secure mail slot? Is there someone designated to go by the church and pick up the mail if the mail is simply going into the mailbox? Do we need to consider putting a lock on the mailbox right now, much like a car dealership might have in their parking lot for you to drop your car keys in if you're going to have service but want to drop the car off after hours? Do we want to ask our congregation to consider making monthly gifts as opposed to weekly gifts so we have fewer deposits and fewer to make and fewer checks to handle? Have you thought about your homebound members or older members or members who are would be considered to be high risk to COVID-19? Maybe you could mail them some prepaid envelopes that already have a stamp on them so that they could mail their gift in and they wouldn't have to go out and purchase envelopes or stamps. Kind of church in a box is what I've heard one congregation was doing to help take care of especially their older members. But let's also look at that online giving platform, encouraging people again to give monthly as opposed to weekly, so we have fewer checks to process and handle, and providing those postage paid or pre-stamped envelopes to our homebound members so that they can continue to contribute and be part of the community of faith as well. We should be thinking about ways in which we are protecting our volunteers. We may need to make some changes to the processes in which we're handling money in order for us to continue to make deposits on time and yet still protect our volunteers. So let's talk openly about those and document the changes that we're going to make. Maybe it's just one person handling the money for just this small period of time, or maybe in a small congregation, you need to mail the money to an individual's home. But let's at least talk about it and document the changes rather than just making them. What documentation should we be modifying for our record keeping? If we're used to having two people on accounting team, maybe we shouldn't have those two individuals because the space in which they normally would count and have access to the technology and equipment would put them too close to one another. Just some things for us to think about. We also might consider what is our liquidity as a congregation. Many of us are concerned about the ability to continue to pay our staff, to meet our mortgage expenses and other operating expenses while we see decreased offerings from people who are not coming to a physical place for worship. Or maybe we didn't have the ability to receive gifts online. So, what resources do we have available to us as a congregation during this time? Do we have CDs, savings accounts at the bank? Do we have funds that have restrictions placed on them? So we need to make sure that we're honoring the restrictions that are there and recognizing that those are designated gifts. These are all things for us to consider during these challenging and unique times so that we can continue to be faithful and to be responsible and to use best practices for financial ethics. So let's talk about auditing and reviews in the congregation. Most of our congregations are of a size and our budgets are such that we don't need to hire an external auditor to come in and review our policies and the applications thereof. But now that we've developed these accountable processes and expected that our leaders are going to follow them, we need to check and verify that they actually are. So we could do something as simple as appointing an audit committee, which is made up of people who aren't the ones that are doing the work right now. So none of our counters, don't include your treasurer or your financial secretary, but people who can follow some basic questions. Have them pull 2 months of bank statements, 2 months of deposits, and 2 months of checks, and a group of 3 to 5 people review and see. Did we pay from an invoice versus paying from a statement? Was the invoice actually signed and authorized by somebody who is authorized to sign an invoice? If we require two signatures over $5,000, did we have two signatures on a check over $5,000? Did we follow our own investment policies and practices in terms of where we're able to place excess funds to ensure that they earn the maximum return with the minimal amount of risk? Do the deposits match? So if we look at 2 months of deposits, is what was on the deposit ticket also what was on the receipt, also what was entered into the accounting software, and also on the total that was recorded by the financial secretary? And then just write up a little report. Did we notice anything? Did we not notice anything? Was everything in great shape? Which is what we really hope we find. Write up the report, put a few copies in the church library or out in the narthex or in one of the hallways. And most people won't bother to look at it, but they will appreciate knowing that you took the time to go through this process and to make sure that we had accountable processes in place. And again, so that we're stewarding the gifts of God from the people of God for the work of God as we've intended. So let's talk about expenses and the reimbursement of those expenses for your employees. There's a list of questions that you, as church leaders, ought to be considering. Who is reviewing the expense report for the pastor and for a staff member? Do we have a written policy in which we are expecting our staff to follow those guidelines? What is the process we expect of them for tracking mileage? And are we providing the resources available for them to do so? Some appropriate expenses that we should have included in our written policy for our pastor and our church staff are directed by the IRS guidelines. And I would encourage you to visit irs.gov or the GSA website in order to determine what those guidelines are each year and for your area, especially around meals and per diem rates. I want to remind you that in 2020, the employee mileage rate currently is 0.575 per mile, so 57 and a half cents per mile, but those rates can be adjusted throughout the year and adjusted and reviewed every year. So make sure that you're staying up to date on those. Our charitable or volunteer rate, which is typically for people to use when they're itemizing deductions on their taxes and not really for reimbursement, is 14 cents per mile. So we should make sure that our policy includes a discussion about things like church meetings and clergy gatherings and continuing education. What expenses will we cover for our pastor to attend General Synod or General Assembly or a local clergy gathering? Will we reimburse their meals? How about books and supplies that they need to prepare for leading worship and for continuing education and study? When it comes to meals, have we authorized our staff to maybe the pastor to take a staff member out to lunch for their birthday or employment anniversary? Take the church secretary out for administrative professionals day? What about alcohol? May our staff be reimbursed for alcoholic beverages while they're on company business? What if they're out with a significant donor? Would we reimburse it if that donor chose to order a glass of wine with dinner? And what are the per diem limits that are available in terms of what kind of meals will we cover and what kind of receipting do we expect? You do have the option of simply writing a check based on the per diem rates for the city in which a person will be traveling and not asking for expense receipts for reimbursement, or you can do the reimbursement, but make sure that you have the proper documentation that the IRS requires. Without proper documentation, such as the receipt that indicates what was purchased, when it was purchased, who it was purchased for, and the amount, as well as the location, if you were to be audited, that could become taxable income to that employee. So let's make sure that our employees are properly substantiating with receipts those items for which they are being reimbursed and not just simply submitting a credit card statement. What about cell phones? Have you all talked about cell phones? Have you talked about it being now a listed property where the IRS allows you to pay 100% of the cost of a cell phone for your pastor or other staff members? What if they're already on a cell phone policy when they come to serve your congregation? Would you be willing to share that cost and do so on a tax advantage reimbursement basis? If so, what needs to be substantiated in order for that reimbursement to occur? And how often are you going to ask that employee to provide that substantiation? So, for example, at Pension Fund, we will either allow certain employees to be on our corporate cell phone plan, or if they were already on a family plan and they're already in a contract, we will reimburse up to $50 per month because that's what our corporate plan costs. And they must annually fill out a form and provide demonstrated proof, so a receipt, that they are continuing to pay and incur that expense every month. And then they're reimbursed monthly for the next 12 months. And then at the beginning of the year, they resubstantiate the expense. So we make sure that they're actually still incurring it. And what about cash expenses like paying for a parking garage or a parking meter? Do you have a written policy about this? The IRS actually says up to $75 can be reimbursed. For us at Pension Fund, we allow up to $10 to be reimbursed for a cash expense without a receipt. So, my friends, this brings us to the close of our webcast today. I hope that you have enjoyed our time. We do have extended opportunities here to engage with more questions, and I would encourage you to use the chat feature to do so. It has been my pleasure to be your host today, and I look forward to us continuing to keep our communities safe as we work towards these financial best practices and good financial ethics for a congregation. And again, if you didn't learn anything today, I hope you at least learned that trust is not an internal control.